Welcome back to Link by Golf. I'm your host Ross McGuire, and in this episode I'm delighted to be joined by Karl Morris. Karl is one of the best known performance coaches in golf and is well known throughout the world. The list of people that he's worked with includes Louis Oosthuizen and Darren Clark, to name but a few. In this episode we learn about Karl's journey in life, how his coaching evolved, and what he's doing today. Let's go over to the show and hear from Karl. Hi there, Karl. Thanks for joining today. Really looking forward to catching up with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. And the way I start the podcast, Karl, is pretty consistent so far. I just ask the guest where they're from and then how they get into golf.
Originally, I was born in Wigan, a famous rugby town, famous rugby league town. And through school, played football, cricket, and didn't really take up golf till quite late. And I'm still not really sure why I ended up playing, really, because my dad didn't play and my mum didn't play. I ended up playing at the local municipal, and then joined a golf club called Lee Golf Club. So I mean, I was always pretty reasonable at sport, to be honest. I was a decent footballer and pretty good cricketer, really. Many years later, I think I should have probably stayed with cricket rather than golf, but that's another tale. And I started to play at a League Golf Club and started playing in competitions. Within a couple of years, I'd actually shot level par in a tournament.
Wow.
Never had any lessons, which was interesting looking back on that.
My goodness.
Yeah.
And what kind of age was it when you started then, Karl?
I would probably have been 14 and a half, 15, something like that.
Okay. So
relatively quite late as opposed to modern day times.
Yeah, but within a couple of years you're shooting level par. That's awesome. So did that then change the competitions you're playing in and what kind of venture you're starting to play in?
Yeah, it's funny enough. I've made that kind of really quick progress, and then I remember somebody saying to me that you've got to this standard pretty quickly. What you should do is, if you really want to improve, is take some lessons. And after never really thinking about my golf swing, and I just used to stand there and just hit this nice little draw shot. Kind of started on the journey of trying to fix my golf swing. You can probably guess where this one's going. And then from just only playing golf and finding ways of putting scores together, then I became obsessed with positions in swings and things like that. And it progressed from there. I didn't really have much of an amateur career, to be honest. I turned professional, struggled again, still struggling with my playing. And then started to focus much more on coaching. And I realised after a few years that all I was doing with my own coaching was passing on to other people what didn't work for me. I was just giving lots of technique out there and sounding very clever, giving lots of information out, and seeing people struggle perhaps as much as I did. And it was that really that prompted me to change direction.
Yeah.
I went away from the game for a couple of years. Completely, I stopped playing, went away from golf, stopped working in golf. I kind of studied lots of different things in terms of the mind and NLP and hypnosis and various other disciplines. I went out to see a guy called Fred Shoemaker in Southern California,
right?
Who had a big influence, or has had a big influence on me. And I came back, and for a couple of years, I've been working with people more on habit control. Things like trying to stop smoking and maybe lose weight and things like that. And I had quite a bit of success with people, and I thought, wow, it's interesting how this approach and understanding a little bit of conscious and subconscious mind, things like that. Came back into golf, started to work with a couple of players, and got really lucky, to be honest. I worked with a guy in the North region of England who was amazing in the sense that he used to shoot ridiculous numbers in pro-ams. He used to shoot 62s and 63s regularly, but never really did that much in 4-round tournaments.
Right.
We started to do some work together.
Uh-huh.
And then a few weeks later, he went to the tour school. He tried a few times at tour school. He went to tour school and shot 27 under par. Finished second in the tour school and got his card. He was a lad called Phil Parch. Billy Parcher, who's actually been doing,
Parcher. Wow.
been doing really well recently on the seniors tour. He could easily have won the Senior British Open last year.
Yeah, what a career he is. Wow.
In those horrendous conditions at Porth Call. But it was from that was the kind of catalyst. I again got the opportunity to work with players like Graeme McDowell and Lee Westwood and Darren Clark, Louis Oosthuizen. So Phil was the first sort of top level player that I worked with, and he had a good few years on tour. He played in the Rolex Trophy. Could have won a couple of it, it's all could and should have, would have kind of thing. But he, up for Brett Rumford chipping in on the last hole at Cram, he could have won the European Masters. But those
that's funny, Brett Rumford.
Yeah,
and Philip Archer came up in the podcast before because I was at an episode of Peter Whiteford, so that's
all right.
Not funny for Peter or Philip, but interesting that Brett Rumford was a cause of grief for both of them. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, I ended up working with Brett years later. Worked for a spell, and it was just a masterclass. Every time I spent time with him, just watching him create incredible shots around the greens. He was just an education. He was just a genius in terms of the short game. I think
there's a lot of stuff posted about him online as well, isn't there? He shares a lot. He doesn't sort of keep it all to himself. He's quite happy to share with people.
I think that was one of the challenges for his own playing career towards the end. He'd been pretty successful. He'd won a few times, and then he was obviously such a great short game player. He ended up each week it was more about him coaching other players because everybody was coming to him for help, and I think it was hard focusing on his own game. So I think he suffered to a degree with helping everybody else and maybe neglecting his own game slightly.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just circling back, Carol, so you wrote a book with Darren Clark called The Mind Factor, and I just wanted to ask you, what was that like at the time, and what kind of process did you go through? What basically took you down the path of doing it?
I mean, I'd worked with Darren for a few years. I mean, we worked together on and off for a good sort of 15, 16 years. In the early years, he won we worked together. Starting about 2003, and he won one of the WGC events during one of the times I was working with him, which was great. And Darren's a very intelligent man. He's a very thoughtful golfer. He's very much a student of the game, and he's always been aware that the mental side of the game is something that has not necessarily come naturally to him. He's one of the most gifted ball strikers I've ever seen. I've often said I've been lucky enough to stand on ranges around the world with some of the best players of the last 25 years, and Darren would be right up there with the most gifted players I've ever seen, Tiger Woods included.
Yeah.
But I just put the idea forward to him about putting a book together, and I pretty much wrote it with Darren's input. It was just a pity it was released in, I think it was 2006 when it was released. I think it had been released in 2010 when he won the Open. I think if there was a picture of Darren on the front cover with the claret jug, it might have sold a few more copies.
You should have done a reprint.
Yeah, we actually suggested that to the publishers years later, and they messed about and didn't sort of jump on the opportunity. But no, it would have been everything's with timing, and the timing was slightly out on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you mentioned a couple of other phenomenal golfers there as well. So Louis Oosthuizen, I know there's a pretty famous story about you with Louis. Was it the 2010 Open that you were working with him? Is that right?
Yeah, I'd started to work with Louis just before that Open. He'd never previously won a major. Never previously made a cut in a major prior to that Open at St Andrews. We got together. He played in the US Open, and he was really struggling, or he said he was struggling getting into the shots and working on his focus and concentration. And I remember saying to him, if you were to describe how you'd want to be when you played a golf shot, what would it be? And I can't remember the exact words. I think it was something around focused or engaged or something like that. And I said to him, if that state had a colour, what would it be? And he looked at me as if it was the silliest question that he's ever heard in his life. We sat in an office in Manchester at the ISM office with Chubby Chandler. And I said, well, if it had a colour, what would it be? And he said, red, I guess. And I'll never forget, there was and he did it. There was a red pen. It was one of those serendipitous moments. There was a red pen on the desk. He had his glove with him. And he said, and he got his glove, and he said, "What? So you're saying that if I put a red dot on my glove here, I could kind of use it as a trigger? If I looked at that red dot, that would be a trigger to get into the shot at hand." From that whole sort of process was born. Really, that he went away, played in the Scottish Open. I think he missed the cut in the Scottish Open, but he said he started to feel a little bit better. And the whole deal was that getting him to look at the dot on the glove before the start of each shot as a trigger to ask a couple of questions and get engaged in what he was actually trying to do. And then went to St Andrews, and the deal was that before every shot, just look at that dot and go through your process. And he shot 64 in the first round. I remember one of the Sky commentators saying that it's nice to see a young player doing well, but there's no way he can hang on for 4 rounds because he's not got enough experience. He's never made a cut in the major before. And then three days later, he's walking up the final hole with a 7-shot lead.
Yeah, he cruised it. I mean, he was unbelievable that week, wasn't he?
It was in the end. It looked like he cruised it, but during the round, it was Paul Casey got pretty close to him around the turn. I think Paul got within 2 shots of Louis, I think, and then Louis eagled. I think it was either 10 or 11. And then just pulled away. But that was the thing. And I remember I was actually back home. I was sat watching it on the TV, and I think on the 15th or the 16th hole, something like that, Peter Allis, the late Peter Allis, actually said on TV, he said something along the lines of, he seems to be doing something strange with a dot on his glove. He seems to be looking at a dot on his glove before every shot.
So he'd actually clocked it.
He'd actually clocked it. And nobody else knew what was going on. He won. Obviously, he won. And then afterwards, the Palomine, Andrew Murray, who was working for 5 Live, I actually rang Andrew up. Said, "You want to know what the story is with the red dot?" And his mobile was switched off. And we spoke a while later.
Right.
He was the first one I told the story to, and then he kind of the rest of the press got hold of it, and then the next couple of days was a bit wild. Really, it was
brilliant.
I remember seeing it. It was pretty much all over the world. It was in the Orlando.
Good for business.
Rawalpindi Express. All the rest of it was. It was one of those lucky moments.
Yeah, and I mean that was quickly followed by, you mentioned Darren Clark winning the Open as well, but also Graeme McDowell winning the US Open, and I know you've spoken about that in the podcast a few times. So, what's your sort of recollection of that time with Graeme?
Yeah, Graeme was another one. Worked with Graeme probably the longest of any client really. I don't see much of him these days, with him obviously being in Orlando, playing on Live now. But we worked with Graeme for 20 years or so. Graeme would be one of those very rare individuals that I would say that the more pressure you put him under, the better he plays. When he was at his best, you could pretty much put your house on him. If you needed somebody to hold a 6-foot putt to save your life, Graeme would be one of those that you probably choose to do it. And he played some terrific golf and won a bunch of tournaments, and was just a very, very gritty campaigner. Obviously, Ryder Cup at Celtic Manor, everybody remembers that.
But I often tell the story that he often talked about playing in tournaments that at times when
he felt very uncomfortable, his body would maybe shake, he'd feel really uncomfortable, but he always felt like he'd come back to some of the processes that we'd worked on and managed to get through. So he was always very open to working on the mental side of the game.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things from listening to your podcast, Karl, that, well, yourself obviously, but you bring in a lot of really fantastic guests, and you touched on it there about Louis. I'd said that it was a pretty easy victory in the end. It looks like that on paper, but every golfer's going through torture at times on the golf course, even if they're cruising what appears to be cruising a victory. There's all sorts of madness going on. So what's your sort of reflections on why do people end up in that position? What do you think is the root cause? Maybe not just particularly golfers, but people in general when they get off track.
I think the root cause for us is being human. And if you're human, you've got a brain, and you've got a brain that produces thoughts. The mind produces thoughts like the heart pumps blood. And I think this one of the big myths I think is that we can control our thoughts. If anybody listening knows what they're going to think next, well, they're certainly far in advance of my level of enlightenment. You just don't know what you're going to think next, and the mind generates all these crazy thoughts and feelings and sensations. And I think, to me, the direction I've gone with players in the last few years is that to gain a greater understanding that you cannot control your thoughts. You can have a different relationship to your thoughts in the sense that you don't always have to believe what you think. And there's a big difference between having thoughts and deliberate thinking, in the sense that, for everybody listening, you might have a thought that I'm going to miss this putt, or you might have a thought I'm going to knock it out of bounds, or you might feel really uncomfortable. But you can, even in the presence of those thoughts, still come back to, all right, what do I need to do right now? It comes back to the actual behaviours that you're going to go through to produce the shot that you want. So this idea that we see players on TV and they're in a perfect state and they're calm and all is just nonsense. That's not the reality. They are often feeling as chaotic as we are, but I think they just find ways of coming back to, it's cliche, but it's so true. They come back to the task. They come back to what they need to do right now. And I think that's a skill that we can all get better at. But I think in the modern world, it's becoming more and more challenging to get good at that skill, because we've got that devil in the pocket that's constantly wanting our attention and constantly flicking around on social media and things like that. So the skill of golf, or the skill of any sport, is the ability to pay attention to what you want to do at the right time. And I think that skill is becoming ever more difficult to develop because of the way the modern world is. But I think that's what great players do. They come back to the task at hand, what they actually need to do right now.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on one of your podcast guests. I'm going to say it's Raymond Pryor. I hope I've got it right. Was he the person that came on and talked about the activity levels of the human brain of people in the 50s versus today? So basically, I think the way he said it was, it'd be like, if you did a reading back in 1950 and gave the results that you get in 2024, people would think you're a schizophrenic because your brain's just so active. It's incredible.
It wasn't Raymond. It was a guy called Izzy Justice, who's a neuroscientist.
Right. Yeah.
But it's not his research. It's from a guy called Daniel Amen, who's a very well-known neuroscientist, and he's measured brain activity, and exactly that. He's found that the average brain activity of the average American is similar to a schizophrenic in the 1950s, which is incredible. Which is frightening. I was only listening to a podcast the other day. There's a guy called Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, I think it is, and he's written a couple of books. One of them, I think, is called The Hijacking of the American Mind. I think he's just written a new book called the Anxious Mind, or the Anxious Generation. And to cut a long story short, he basically says that since 2012, the advent of the smartphone, is that the mental health of folk of all ages, of all levels, but in particular younger people, has really plummeted because we're constantly on these devices, we're constantly scrolling through social media, we're constantly our attention is constantly being sort of subjected to all these sort of demands and these messages and alerts and what have you, and the brain just isn't designed to actually take on that level of stimulus. So I think I see it more now than ever. It does really worry me, and I look at the AI and things like that, and I think, wow, where are we heading? And it's not that long ago. I mean, not sure what vintage you are, but I can think back to being at school. I remember it was in the early 80s. When we were at school, it was a huge thing that when there was going to be a fourth channel on the TV. When there used to be there just used to be BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, and then Channel 4 came along. And it was like, wow, there's going to be another channel on the TV. It was like this huge event. And then fast forward 40 years or so, me and my wife often sit down at night and we'll say, well, there's nothing on telly tonight, and then we've got probably 5,000 options, and we can't find anything.
And then you're scrolling a TV for about 4 hours trying to find a series to watch or something, and then it invariably ends in a binge watch because it's the only thing to do.
The tyranny of choice. The tyranny of choice is a terrible thing, and I think back to those days, and without sounding like a total luddite, the only way people could get hold of you in those days was that really quiet thing about a house phone, a landline. I look back and I think, my goodness, we probably didn't appreciate just how simple life was and straightforward life was. And I'm not saying all technology is bad, but certainly all technology is not good either.
It was funny in the first episode that a guy on that I knew from junior golf days, a guy called Gary Dingwall. He's a head teaching professional at Dornoch. And one of the stories was that one of his friends was at college in the States and was basically saying, hey Gary, we can find you a place and get you over here. How do you think he got him? Phoned the golf club. Of course that's where he's going to be. So it's literally, as you're saying, phone the house phone, doesn't get him, phones the golf club, got him, or he'd put in the golf course, he'd come in and somebody would tell him, and that was it. Really, really simple.
Well, it's like the other end, that I think we can all relate to. Maybe if our fathers liked a pint or two at night, that if it was a little bit too late, the wife would ring the pub to get him to come home.
Yeah, so Carl, in terms of yourself, though, I mean, you're doing great work to challenge these situations for people. I mean, you generally are. I've attended some of your sessions both in the past at Dalmahoy and certainly online actually with Farnham, and I listen to your podcast every week, literally. So, but you also do in-person sessions. I was wondering if you could talk about some of those and what sort of activities you get people involved in as well.
Yeah, we get a chance to work with people. There's various options. I mean, these days, I've been knocking technology, but one of the great things about technology is what we're doing now is that you can be in a different part of the country, and I kind of can communicate. I do have people who get in touch and clients around the world, Australia, New Zealand, and some people work with me online. And I don't do one-off sessions. I just do programs over a period of time because I think you can get some real good work done if there's a commitment from both sides.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I still love to do is that I still love to work with people who are prepared to come over and we can spend time on the golf course, and I can really genuinely see what's going on in terms of, you learn so much on the golf course. You really see the true golfer, and you probably heard me say this on the podcast, but it's still a source of incredible sort of mystery to me that we embark on trying to improve the game. We take coaching, and the vast majority of people who take coaching are never seen on the golf course. We take coaching in an environment that's very, very removed from the real thing. And I'm not saying there's no value in that. Clearly there is. But I think, can you imagine in football, if you had a football manager who never saw his players actually play on a pitch, and then he actually sat them down on a Monday morning and said, how did you get on last week, or how did you play? I mean, I think that there'd be a little bit of a gap between the reports and the reality.
Yeah, played great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, played great. Yeah, just struggling a little bit when we passed him, but overall it was brilliant. It's a nonsense really that we don't spend more time actually on the golf course in a coaching situation. There's a very, very solid economic model that has been set up with coaching where it's delivered in half-hour slots or hour slots over and over and over again. And there's a good economic model there, but I'm not sure that's the most efficient or effective model for the student.
Yeah, especially, I mean, for myself, I play at a golf course, and just give an example, there's quite a lot of water on it. So if anyone's struggling with like water balls, I mean, why would you be on the driving range? The driving range is completely dry. It doesn't take long getting on the thing as the fourth hole and then the seventh hole. Find water all day long, so it's much, much better place to practice for sure. And I have lost a few golf balls in there.
I remember having a conversation with Mike Malone from Trackman years ago, and Mike's a real forward thinker and a very bright guy. He was saying, this is a long time ago, obviously now, but I remember him saying that he said, we started to take the Trackman out onto the golf course with quite a few plays, and he said, he looked at us and he said, the numbers are so different on the golf course. That's the real surprise, because it is, your brain responds to an environment, and when you're in an environment where you're hitting balls into a big field and there's no consequence, your brain's going to respond differently when you stood there with you only get one chance and there's water left out of bounds right and the wind's blowing off your left shoulder. That's going to engineer different movement patterns than when you just stood on a flat lie on a range in wide open field.
Yeah, and I bet it gives results both ways actually, where players are, for example, tight even in practice and don't maybe hit the ball as strongly as they normally do, and then of course when in competitions are amped up and hitting it miles. So you're right, it's got to be in competition before you understand what you're doing. So then the podcast, Karl, over 300 episodes. What's that journey been like for you? What's the experience been like for you?
Yeah, it's obviously a long one, and it's each week rolls by and I get one out and I say, oh, that's great, I've got another one out, and then Monday morning comes around and I think, oh Christ, I'm going to get another one done. But yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Really, had a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of great people have been on the podcast who are willing to come on. Ellen Langer was on recently. He's one of the legends of social psychology. I kind of keep trying to reinforce similar message to people with some of the things that I say to kind of introduce it, and the people coming on don't always completely agree with that, but I think a lot of people, there seems to be some common threads that keep coming back over and over again. So no, I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm surprised when some of the people say yes and come on and give their time willingly, and I think it's just a great way of sharing information, because I think in the coaching world and the playing world, golf can be quite a lonely place at times, can't it? So I think to get up there, and there's not millions of people download the podcast, but I think there's a reasonable audience there, and I do go and do seminars at golf clubs and things like that, and it's really quite rewarding when people come up and say, I do listen to your podcast, and I listen to it every Friday, and I've got a lot from it. So that's the real reward in the end when you've been doing it for 6 years or so now, something like that. Then people stay pretty loyal to it.
Yeah, and you're funny. You were talking about Andrew Murray. Is that the guy that won the European Open one year? Mm-hmm. I was genuinely listening to your podcast with him on it one day driving at the golf course, because my head was in the usual place, which would not be a good place. So I'm thinking, right, how am I going to get my head back on for what I'm about to play? And it was a match play event. So long story short, that episode with Andrew Murray, he talks about when he won the European Open, it was something mad, like he was lifting his left heel off the ground because he found out Faldo had been doing it in the Open quite recent before that. So I've listened to this in the podcast. I'm like, right, here we go. I've got the latest thing I need to try. I'm on the driving range before I play, left heel up, went out. I'm 5 under through 11. Unbelievable. Cruising the best I've played in probably about 7 years. And it was phenomenal. And it was that one thing because it just took my brain away from all the other garbage that was going on. So it's phenomenal and that's obviously a very, very short-term thing. Needless to say, that's not continued in terms of my own golf, but it is amazing how the mind can get so confused all the time as well. And it just takes something very simple to get you back on track.
I think what we do is we put too much attention on the what, as in lifting the left heel or whatever the thought may be, and we don't understand enough of what the why is, and why does that make us play good? It's not so much the tip, as you say. It's more that the mind is quiet. It's just settled in one place. So surely we should be moving more in that direction of understanding how to settle the mind a little bit more when we're actually playing golf, rather than constantly, to reinforce what we said earlier on, constantly in this latest fix, latest tip, and our mind going round in circles. The best players I've seen over the years do have a skill for keeping this thing simple.
Absolutely. And then just finally, Karl, I noticed, and I've been listening to the podcast obviously, but you've got an app that people can use. It's called the Mind Caddie. So do you want to talk a little bit about the app as well, and what people can gain from that?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Yeah, it's called the Mind Caddie. So you can go to the App Store and download it as a free version where you can test a few things out. But essentially, if you go to the full version, there's a bunch of programs on there, like skill development and what you do before the game, and how you process a game afterwards, the in-between time when we're on the golf course. But probably most importantly, there's a couple of sections in there about how to effectively journal better, so you become. Ultimately, what I hope to do with the app is get every golfer to understand a little bit more about themselves, about what makes them tick. And if you go with it and you stay with some of the key programs on it, you'll at the end of a year or so, you'll really know an awful lot more about your own game and what you need to do to get the best out of yourself.
Yeah, fantastic. And then, Karl, a question. So, one of the guys that you had on recently on the podcast described you as one of the greatest minds in golf in terms of the sports psychology attached to it. And I have to say, he's completely right. I mean, yourself, Bob Rotella, those are the names that come to people's minds when they're talking about sports psychologists related to golf. So it's an incredible career you've had. What advice would you have for people that are thinking about getting into coaching, or they want to develop their coaching methods and get away from, I don't want to say the madness of the technique side, but maybe take a different approach than what they do today?
I would say just explore this area, be willing to sort of do things a little bit differently, try and gain more of an understanding about how the mind works. I mean, my background is completely non-academic. In many ways, I've got no qualifications for this other than experience and actually working with players. So I just think it's a willingness to just maybe step out away from the norm, because I sort of got to a point where I've concluded that everybody playing golf should focus on two things. Number one, most importantly, you should work on developing skills. You do need golfing skills. You need to understand what the golf club needs to do to produce shots, what you need to do to hit short shots, etc. So you need to develop skills. It's not all in the mind. Once you've developed skills, you need to know how to access those skills when you're actually playing, when it actually really matters for you. So that isn't just about developing the skill, it's understanding what you need to do to access those skills when it really matters.
So, Karl, just wrapping up here, any social media handles or websites you want to share with the listeners for follow-up with you?
Yeah, I'm terrible on social media. I said my wife's the one who does all that. I've got no interest in it whatsoever, which is a terrible admission, but I might as well be truthful. The best place to get hold of me is just go to the website, the mindfactor.com. There's emails. I'm pretty responsive on email, so if that's the best way to get hold of me, really.
Fantastic. Well, Karl, look, I really appreciate you coming on. You've come on your Saturday when your favourite team are playing football. I hope the result goes the right way for you, but I really appreciate it. This has been great to hear from you. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed that one, folks. It was truly an honour for me to have Karl on the show. And from that show, I'm sure you could tell he's really one of the best in the business. If you look at some of the people he's worked with, the results that they've had, and some of the breakthroughs that he's had with people in terms of their golf and life, I'm sure you'll be blown away. In terms of follow-ups, please remember to like, share and subscribe to the podcast, and I'll have another episode out soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.